Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallama ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. The guiding question of this lesson is logic permissible? We saw in the first part of this lesson that answering this question requires us to first clearly define what we mean by logic and then to clearly define what we mean by permissibility. So we began by defining logic, asking the question, what is logic? We defined logic as the rules of correct reasoning, and we illustrated this definition with two Quranic examples. And as we illustrated this definition, we used many technical terms such as premise, minor premise, major premise, categorical, syllogism, conceptual knowledge, propositional knowledge, definition, conjunctive proposition, conditional proposition, antecedent, consequent. All of these large technical names lead us to ask the question, where in the world did these terms come from? The answer to this question is that these terms of logic were first taught in the ancient Greek city of Athens by the Hellenistic philosopher Aristotle about 2,500 years ago as he walked around a temple called the Lyceum. The temple Lyceum was a pagan temple dedicated to a Greek god called Apollo. Now, as Muslims, this naturally leads us to ask another question, namely, can it be permissible to study logic if it is a discipline that originated in a pagan temple? Now, someone who asks this question has not fully understood what logic is. That is why the previous lesson, which answered the question, what is logic, needs to be supplemented with this lesson, which seeks to answer the question, what does it mean for logic to be Aristotelian or for it to be Islamic? Understanding the answer to this question requires a short lesson in history. The lesson in history begins with the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle taught in a period that historians call the period of antiquity. Aristotle's work in logic and philosophy did not come out of nowhere. Rather, it built on the work of philosophers before him, most notably his teacher Plato and Plato's teacher Socrates. Aristotle's work was then followed by the work of many philosophers after him, most notably his student Theophrastus, and 500 years later by the famous Egyptian-born Alexandrian philosopher Plotinus. These are just some of the most influential philosophers before and after Aristotle. Otherwise, there were dozens of other prominent philosophers that could be mentioned. The point here is just to illustrate that philosophy was a vigorous discipline in the period of antiquity, both before and after Aristotle. This changed in the period that followed the period of antiquity, which historians call the medieval period. They also call it the Middle Ages. This period began with the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who converted to Christianity and ordered the philosophical school of Athens, where Aristotle taught, to be closed because it was perceived as a threat to Christianity. The general tenor of Christian lands in the medieval period was marked by a similar prohibition against any kind of reasoning that might lead to conclusions that threatened the positions of the state-sponsored church on religious as well as philosophical and scientific matters. As a result, Aristotelian philosophy was lost and forgotten in Christian Europe. About 700 years later, Christian philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas used Aristotelian philosophy as a tool for theology. Aquinas is an important figure because he was honored as a saint by the Catholic Church and hailed by church authorities as a model Christian philosopher. When Christianity fell into conflict with philosophy and science in the age that historians call the Enlightenment, much of the conflict centered around his writings. The Enlightenment was the precursor of the modern age, and Aquinas' work thus played a crucial role in the creation of what we now call modernity. The question is, if Aristotelian philosophy was lost and forgotten for most of the medieval period, how was it rediscovered by Aquinas towards the end of the medieval period? Part of the answer is that it was not completely lost and forgotten, but only almost lost and forgotten. One important and notable remnant was an introduction to Aristotle's works written by the pagan philosopher Porphyry. This introduction was called the Isagogy, which comes from the Greek Isagauge, which means introduction. 200 years later, around the time when Justinian closed the school of Athens, the Roman philosopher Boethius translated Porphyry's Isagogy from Greek into Latin. Boethius's translation was studied and commented on by Aquinas' predecessors, most notably by the Christian scholastics Abelard and Anselm, and then by Aquinas himself. The standard language of Christian theology at this time was Latin, not Greek, and that's why Boethius's translation is important. After which it became a standard medieval textbook in late medieval European schools and universities. But that's only part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that throughout the medieval period, Aristotelian philosophy was extensively translated, studied, critiqued, and elaborated in the Muslim world. The period in which Justinian closed the school of Athens is part of a transition period between antiquity and the medieval period that historians call the period of late antiquity, and they also call it the early medieval period. This is exactly the period in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was born. Shortly after the Prophet ﷺ passed away from this world to his Lord, his followers conquered a large part of the Byzantine Empire, including most notably the city of Alexandria in Egypt. Alexandria is an important city because it was a center of Aristotelian philosophy. Both Porphyry, who wrote the Isagogy, and Plotinus, an important philosopher who succeeded and developed the works of Aristotle, both of these philosophers, as well as many others, were Alexandrian. The Prophet's followers also conquered the entirety of the Persian Empire. Persia is also important because it was a center of Aristotelian philosophy. It became a center of Aristotelian philosophy when Justinian closed the school of Athens. At this point, the leading philosophers of the Lyceum left to teach in Persia. The intellectual heritage of these two centers of Aristotelian philosophy, the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, merged with additional philosophical elements from Egypt, Persia, and even Mesopotamia and India, and slowly became the property of Muslims. During the period when Christian Europe lost and forgot Aristotelian philosophy, the Muslim world preserved it. Unlike the Christian Emperor Justinian, the Muslim caliphs never prohibited the study of philosophy. On the contrary, they promoted it. Ibn al-Muqaffa, state secretary first to the Umayyads and then to the Abbasids, is held by some to be the author of an early Arabic translation of Porphyry's Isagogy, the same work that was famously translated by Boethius into Latin. Throughout the 8th and 9th centuries, the Abbasid caliphs patronized the translation of works of Greek philosophy and medicine into Arabic. These translations were then studied extensively by the Muslims, most notably by the Persian Muslim philosopher Avicenna, who systematized the Greek philosophical corpus and attempted to synthesize it with Islamic beliefs. He was followed 100-odd years later by the Spanish Muslim philosopher Averroes, who wrote numerous commentaries on Arabic translations of Aristotle's works. Avicenna and Averroes had a huge influence, not just on Aquinas, but on generations of Jewish and Christian philosophers and theologians before and after Aquinas. This is the other part of the answer to the question that we are examining. Namely, if Aristotelian philosophy was lost and forgotten for most of the medieval period, how was it rediscovered by Aquinas towards the end of the medieval period? The answer is that Christian philosophers before and after Aquinas rediscovered Aristotelian philosophy through Latin translations of the works of Muslim philosophers such as Avicenna and Averroes. That's why the name by which these two philosophers are known by are Latinized versions of their Arabic names. Avicenna is a Latinization of the Arabic Ibn Sina, and Averroes is a Latinization of the Arabic Ibn Rushd. It was because the Muslims preserved Aristotelian philosophy that Christian Europe could rediscover Aristotelian philosophy at the time of Aquinas and slightly before him, and this was what led to the Enlightenment, which in turn led to the modern age. Were it not for the fact that Muslims preserved Aristotelian philosophy, the Christians would never have brought about the modern age. This, however, is only the beginning of the story of Aristotelian philosophy in the Muslim world. the story continues for several hundred years after this point. But these several hundred years have mostly been ignored by Western scholars because their principal interest in Aristotelian philosophy has been its role in the history of the Western world, Enlightenment, modernity, and so on, not its role in the history of the Muslim world. The whole story is that before, during, and after the development of the various philosophical sciences of Aristotle, Muslims investigated their greatest intellectual efforts not in Aristotelian philosophical sciences, but in a series of religious sciences that were based on revelation. Muslim scholars such as Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi'i, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal developed the science of sacred law. Muslim scholars such as Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood, and Nasa'i developed the science of hadith criticism. And scholars such as Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, Bayhaqi, Baqillani, and Juwayni developed the science of rational theology or kalam. These were 3 of a 20-odd sciences that Muslim scholars developed to transmit, explain, rationalize, and apply the revelation that was received by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A crucially important scholar who mastered these sciences was Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Imam al-Ghazali, may Allah have mercy on him, is an important figure in our quick history lesson because he was one of the first religious scholars to apply the revelatory sciences to the philosophical sciences of Aristotle. He was followed in this application by generations of scholars after him. One of the most important of these scholars was Fakhruddin al-Razi, at whose hands we might say the religious sciences swallowed Aristotelian philosophy. Here's a more precise description of what happened. The Muslims referred to the Aristotelian philosophical sciences as falsafa. Falsafa was divided into 2 kinds of sciences: the theoretical sciences, which were studied purely to be known, and the practical sciences, which were studied not just to be known, but to be applied and practiced. What this means will become clear shortly. The theoretical sciences were further divided into 3 kinds of sciences: metaphysics, mathematics, and natural science. The goal of metaphysics was to study non-physical and immaterial things, most importantly, God, who the Aristotelian philosophers believed was the source of all other existent things. The widespread acceptance of atheism among philosophers and scientists is a distinctly modern phenomenon. Before the modern age, everyone believed in God, even pagan philosophers like Aristotle. But the God in which Aristotle believed was not like the God that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam called us to believe in. The God of Aristotle, as understood by Avicenna, did not possess any free will, could not make the things of the universe in any other way than except the way that they actually were, and did not know everything. The scholars of the science of rational theology or kalam thoroughly engaged the science of metaphysics to demonstrate that the proper application of reason proved the existence of a God with free will, who was all-powerful, all-knowing, who created the universe from nothing, who sent messengers, and who will resurrect us after death to judge us and to send us to one of our 2 eternal abodes. They demonstrated, in other words, that the proper application of philosophical reasoning proved the existence of the God of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not the God of Aristotle or Avicenna. Aristotle and Avicenna did not live up to their own standards of philosophy, and the Muslim scholar did a better job at it than they did. Kalam incorporated the questions and vocabulary of the Aristotelian science of metaphysics, cleared away its mistakes, and turned it into one of the religious sciences. Kalam swallowed metaphysics. The goal of the natural sciences was to study material and physical things, such as the sun, the stars, the mountains, the trees, and human beings. The natural sciences, in other words, studied what modern science studies today. Many of the scientific conclusions of the Aristotelian natural sciences have been shown by modern science to be mistakes. The focus of Muslim religious scholars, however, was to study those aspects of the natural sciences that conflicted with religion. Most prominently, the belief that the processes of nature were fixed and immutable, and that even God could not make the universe work in a different way than it does. They did this again through the science of kalam, which swallowed the natural sciences just as it swallowed the science of metaphysics. It should now be clear why Kalam is the most closely intertwined of all of the religious sciences with Aristotelian philosophy. The goal of the science of mathematics was to study things like numbers and shapes, which were immaterial when conceived in the mind, but material in their application to the physical things of the universe. Muslim scholars such as Ghazali observed that this science was the most accurate of the sciences of the Aristotelian philosophers and contained nothing that conflicted with religion. Muslim scholars studied this science, improved it, and applied it not only in engineering projects such as the construction of magnificent mosques, but also to the religious sciences, most notably in the calculation of the direction of prayer and the calculation of inheritance shares, both of which were part of the sciences of sacred law. Note that the theoretical sciences all studied things merely for the sake of knowing them, not for the sake of improving human action. The practical sciences, on the other hand, were studied to improve and regulate human actions. Like the theoretical sciences, they were further divided into three sciences. The goal of the science of ethics was to study virtuous character traits, such as bravery, generosity, and forbearance, or, in other words, the goal of the science of ethics was to study proper human action as it relates to oneself. The goal of the science of household administration was to study proper human action with respect to the people of one's household, the proper human action between husband and wife, parents and children, and, because those were the days of slavery, master and slave. The goal of the science of politics was to study proper human action with respect to government officials and their citizenry. All three of these sciences were replaced by the science of sacred law, or fiqh, whose goal is to discern proper human action in all spheres of life, whether it relates to oneself, to members of one's household, to between government officials and citizenry, or anything else. It does this by discerning the command of Allah Most High regarding every possible human action. Many of the questions of the science of ethics were also answered by the science of Sufism, which sought to develop those human character traits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us to acquire, such as bravery, generosity, gratitude, repentance, and love of God, and to eliminate those human character traits which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had commanded us to eliminate, such as envy, rancor, pride, and showing off in one's good works. We are now ready to answer the question of this lesson, namely, what does it mean for logic to be Aristotelian or Islamic? Let's begin by studying what it means for logic to be Aristotelian. Remember first that logic is a criterion for correct thinking. To understand what it means for logic to be Aristotelian, we need to investigate how an Aristotelian philosopher would have used this criterion to think correctly. An Aristotelian scholar would have used logic as a criterion for correct thinking as they developed their 6 kinds of philosophical sciences. This criterion was indispensable. Before anyone could study these philosophical sciences, they had to study Aristotelian logic so that they could do these philosophical sciences correctly and come to the right conclusions. In our quick history lesson, we learned about a book called the Isagogy that was written by a philosopher called Porphyry 500 years after Aristotle. Porphyry's Isagogy was a work in Aristotelian logic that was expressly written for the purpose of equipping students with the logical tools and criteria that they would need in order to do Aristotelian philosophy. Now, think for a moment about the philosophical sciences. Think in particular about the sciences of metaphysics and the natural sciences, which used Aristotelian logic incorrectly, which used Aristotelian logic to incorrectly show that God does not have free will, that he cannot make the things of the universe be any other way than the way that they are, and that he doesn't know everything. They could only have come to these conclusions if, possibility 1, Aristotelian logic was insufficiently detailed to prevent such mistakes in reasoning, or, possibility number 2, Aristotelian logic included criteria of correct reasoning that were in fact incorrect criteria, Or possibility number 3, they used Aristotelian logic incorrectly. All three are in fact true, and all three were fixed by Islamic logic. To understand what it means for logic to be Islamic, remember first that the Islamic sciences swallowed philosophy. Here's a brief outline of the Islamic or revelatory sciences. We won't describe them in detail in this lesson. Just as Aristotelian logic was the criterion for correct thinking that the Aristotelian philosophers used in their sciences, Islamic logic was the criterion for correct thinking that Muslim scholars used in their sciences. The origin of Islamic logic was Aristotelian logic. The science of kalam we just saw swallowed the Aristotelian sciences of metaphysics and natural science. As it swallowed those sciences, it corrected their mistakes using Aristotelian logic. And as it corrected their mistakes using Aristotelian logic, it refined, developed, and corrected Aristotelian logic until it came to be a criterion for correct thinking that was indispensable for anyone who studied kalam. This criterion for correct thinking is what we are calling Islamic logic. Islamic logic was quickly adopted by scholars of Kalam's sister science, the science of legal theory, which, together with Kalam, constitutes what Muslim scholars call the two foundations of religion, or in Arabic, al-Aslain. Shortly after Razi, an important Muslim scholar called Athiruddin al-Abhari wrote an introduction to Islamic logic that was inspired by the introduction to Aristotelian logic that had been written almost 1,000 years ago by Porphyry and translated into Arabic 500 years ago by Ibn al-Muqaffa. The introduction had the same name as Porphyry's introduction. It was called the Isagogi, or in Arabic, Isagogi. This is the book that we will be studying in this course. Although Islamic logic was initially used mainly by the scholars of Kalam and legal theory, it quickly came to be used as a criterion for correct thinking by scholars of all the Islamic sciences. Any science that does inference needs a criterion for correct inference, and it made sense to use the criterion that the scholars of Kalam and legal theory were using in their sciences. Just as Porphyry's isagogy was used as a criterion for correct thinking by Aristotelian philosophers, Abhari's isagogy was used as a criterion for correct thinking by the scholars of the Islamic sciences. Porphyry's isagogy then was a tool of Aristotelian philosophy. It was used as a criterion of correctness for non-religious inference to questions such as what exists, what is the soul, what is a giraffe, do universals exist, what is the value of pi, how do I live a happy life? If there was an image for the kind of inquiry that Porphyry's isagogy was designed to facilitate, it would be a statue called the Thinker, which shows a naked male figure sitting on a rock with his chin resting on his hand as though in deep thought. I haven't included an image of the statue in the slide here because it is religiously impermissible to make or look at statues of animate life, and even more religiously impermissible to look at statues of human beings that reveal areas of their body that are impermissible to look at, so don't Google the image. Abhari's isagogy, on the other hand, was a tool for religious inquiry. It was used as a criterion of correctness for the answer to the single question that summarizes the rational inquiry of all the Islamic sciences, namely, what does God want from me? If there was an image for the kind of inquiry that Abhari's isagogy facilitated, it would be the image of the Kaaba encircled by thousands of prostrating worshippers. It is important to remember here that the religious sciences swallowed the philosophical sciences, and so Abhari's isagogy was also used as a criterion for correct thinking to answer the questions of Aristotelian philosophy, such as the ones that we just saw. But that happened in the higher context of the Islamic sciences, which subsumed the Aristotelian sciences as we have described previously in this lesson. The difference between Aristotelian and Islamic logic, then, is like the difference between Newtonian and Einsteinian physics. Physics, regardless of whether it is Newtonian or Einsteinian, seeks to objectively describe matter and motion. Objectively means that there is one correct description of matter and motion that both Newton and Einstein sought to discover. Einstein, however, did a better job than Newton because he came after Newton and was able to build and improve on what Newton did. Similarly, the goal of logic is to objectively describe the rules of correct reasoning. Objectively here means that there is one correct description of the rules of correct reasoning that both Aristotle and Muslim scholars sought to discover. The Muslim scholars, however, did a better job than Aristotle and Avicenna because they came after them and were able to build and improve on what they did. This, then, is the difference between Aristotelian and Islamic logic. On their fundamental questions and concerns, there's no difference. At a more detailed level, however, Islamic logic is more accurate, more highly developed, and more correctly used than Aristotelian logic. Islamic logic, in other words, is more logical than Aristotelian logic. Islamic logic got it right, whereas Aristotelian logic missed the mark on many of its questions. Note that we haven't answered the question that we posed early in this lesson, namely, can it be permissible to study a discipline that originated in a pagan temple? The reason is that this question is simply a highly emotional restatement of the overarching question that we are investigating in this lesson, namely, is logic permissible, which we have seen cannot be answered until we understand what exactly its terms mean. The goal of this lesson, along with the previous one, was to help clarify the meaning of the first term, logic. In the next lesson, we will clarify the meaning of the second term, permissibility. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم وهو حسبنا ونعم الوكيل.